So it's good to be sort of back with you. So before I begin talking about what's happening in New South Wales, I also want to just say Port Macquarie is one of our strongest areas as far as supporters for voluntary assisted dying, and that's primarily thanks to the previous branch leader, who's Annie Quadro. So I wanted to just say that, and also the current leader, who's Paul Newman, who I did see is here somewhere. So yes, there he is. So thank you, Paul, and thank you all, any of you, if you've come along through Dying with Dignity. So before we get started, I'll introduce our special guests. We've got Dr. Cam McLaren, who is a Victorian medical oncologist who has been involved with the voluntary assisted dying scheme in Victoria since it began, and he's assisted over 100 patients, terminally ill Victorians, who have needed to access this law, and he can tell us the exact figure, but I think he's actually been at the bedside for about 30 of those. And our second guest is Janet Cohen, who some of you may know. She's a local Camden Haven resident, and Janet has been living with terminal lung cancer since 2013. Fortunately, she's been able to access life-extending treatments, so she's reasonably well now, but she did want the choice of not having to suffer at the end stage of her illness if she reached that stage. So she has also pre-registered for a clinic in Switzerland called Life Circle. And so if her pain and suffering becomes unacceptable, that's her current plan. I'm not sure, her doctor in Switzerland, Dr. Erika Preissig, had actually registered for the session tonight. So obviously we've got quite a few people here now. I'm not sure if Erika's here, but if you are, Erika, you're welcome. Welcome to Australia. So let's get started. And remember, if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll look across, or Kia will notify me if any questions come in. Now, there may be people here tonight who are new to the issue of voluntary assisted dying. So I will give a bit of a background, but I assume that everybody knows what we're talking about when I refer to voluntary assisted dying. We used to call it voluntary euthanasia. So Australia was actually the first country in the world to have a voluntary assisted dying law. It was back in the 1995, and it was the Parliament of the Northern Territory that passed the Rights of the Terminally Ill Act. But unfortunately, being a territory, the federal government, at the time it was a Liberal government led by John Howard, took away that power and overturned that law. So only 4 people were able to access that law. It took another 20 years before another state was able to pass assisted dying, despite over 30 attempts. So many of you look like you're in the age group, my age group, that would have remembered a lot of those attempts. But there was a successful attempt in late 2017, and that was, of course, Victoria. And now Victoria has had their law operating for over a year, and we'll certainly hear more about that when I speak to Cam. So I have done notes mainly so that I don't run way over time, because if I ramble on, I could do that. So I apologise for glancing down occasionally. So we really knew that once one state passed in Australia, that it would, it would move, the other states would move reasonably quickly, and that did happen. Not as quickly as maybe some of us would like. But Western Australia was the second state to pass a law, and their law was passed in December last year, and it will come into effect halfway through next year. But right at the moment, all eyes are on Tasmania, because just a few weeks ago, a private member's bill introduced by an upper house member called Mike Gaffney passed in the upper house unanimously. And that is an incredible achievement. That there is no other parliament. We have laws around the world for assisted dying, but I have not heard of any that have passed through their parliament with a unanimous vote. So because it started in the upper house, that's now going to go to the lower house. and that debate starts tomorrow. So if any of you are particularly interested in this issue and would be interested, they do live stream the debates. So you will be able to hear the speeches by the members of the lower house. You just go to the Tasmanian Parliament website and there will be a link to live streaming or something like that, webcast it might be called. And it's not just Tasmania. Today, literally probably half an hour ago, an upper house member of the Labor Party in South Australia, Cam introduced, tabled a bill in the South Australian Parliament. So that's amazing. And then in Queensland, the Queensland Premier, Anastasia Palaszczuk, used her campaign launch 2 weeks out from the election to make a pledge that she would introduce voluntary assisted dying legislation in February 2021. So it was quite a calculated decision, I think, because it really, with 2 weeks out from the election, there was a difference between the Liberal and Labor position, because the Labor Party in Queensland has a position to support voluntary assisted dying, whereas the Liberal National Party is opposed. So it certainly didn't harm her prospects. The Labor Party was re-elected, so we can look forward to a debate in Queensland, South Australia and Tasmania when parliaments resume early in 2021. So where am I up to? It's not just Australia though. Just in October, the New Zealand Parliament held a referendum. So when they held their national election, they had 2 referendum questions, and one of them was about their End of Life Choices Act. So their law passed through the Parliament, but as a condition of it passing, one of the parties over there insisted that the law be put to the people in a referendum, and only if a majority of Kiwis supported it would it become law and the law would be enacted. So we were all hanging in. There was a lot of money spent by opponents, I have to say, a lot of misinformation circulated, and it was touch and go for a while. But in the end, just over 65% of New Zealanders voted to support the End of Life Choices Act. So the whole of New Zealand will have a law, assisted dying law, by November next year. So there's a lot of momentum, and some people might ask, why all of a sudden? But the main reason why the momentum is accelerating is because we know that the laws work. Back in 1997, when the Howard government overturned the Northern Territory law, at around the same time, a US state of Oregon passed the Death with Dignity Act. So that became the first state in America to pass a law. So by the time that was 1997, so, there's 23 years of experience, but not just from Oregon. There's now 9 jurisdictions in the US. There's a number of countries in Europe, Colombia. There is a lot of evidence that these laws, the safeguards work, and all the fear-mongering that happened or used to happen in the lead up to debates, and certainly in all the Australian debates about the slippery slope and, people are going to knock off their granny for the inheritance. All of those arguments they're just not convincing anymore because we have so much evidence. And the great thing about the current situation in Australia is that now we have our own experience. As I mentioned, the Voluntary Assisted Dying Act was passed in 2017. There was an 18-month implementation, but it's now been operating for over 12 months. We know from the first annual report that 124 terminally ill Victorians have been able to access this compassionate end-of-life choice, die peacefully surrounded by the people they love, which is just what we imagined. So it's not surprising that other states want to follow suit. So this is probably the right time to introduce Dr. Cam McLaren. As I said, Cam's a Victorian oncologist, but he's here tonight mainly to speak about the voluntary assisted dying scheme in Victoria. So Cam, we called this topical talk voluntary assisted dying, who can access it? So can my first question be about eligibility? So who can actually access the law in Victoria?
Yeah, hi Shayne, thank you, and thanks for having me, and also thanks to the Port Macquarie Library. I've got lots of good memories coming up, or actually it was down to Port Macquarie at the time to go to Fantasy Glades and Peppermint Park with my grandmother when I was young. I seem to remember that one or both don't exist anymore, and please don't tell me that because I don't want to know. So in terms of getting back to the point of why I'm here, in terms of eligibility of voluntary assisted dying, so we have what we call demographic and then condition or illness qualifiers or eligibility criteria. So in Victoria, you have to be over the age of 18, be an Australian permanent resident or a citizen. You have to be a Victorian resident for more than 12 months to prevent people from coming to the state for the purposes of accessing voluntary assisted dying. And from a medical point of view, you have to have a diagnosis of an incurable, progressive medical condition with an expected prognosis of less than 6 months, and then that is extended to less than 12 months if that condition is a neurological condition such as MS or motor neurone disease. The other points that we also focus on are things like this has to be voluntary, this has to be free from coercion, and I think that was a real worry, going into this sort of legislation, is whether that would be an actual factor, and much of our training was focused around trying to figure that out, and we really haven't seen a lot of it. Well, I personally only had had to address it once, and then it wasn't actually present in that case. And then the other thing is that people have to have medical capacity to make the decisions for themselves. So this is important because it doesn't allow people to carry out these sorts of wishes in an enduring fashion. You can't put this in your advanced care directive, or if you lose capacity, if I develop dementia and I'm unable to make this decision, I want that to be proceeded with. You actually can't do that. You have to have capacity at every step along the way, and no one can make the decision for you. So it's not something that is included in a medical treatment decision maker arrangement or next of kin, or those sorts of arrangements.
And I believe that obviously there's one of the clauses is that the person has intolerable suffering. So could you explain what that means in reality? How bad does someone have to be?
Yeah, well, there's no objective measure of suffering, is there? Most of the time, the suffering that we see is this existential suffering, this living in fear and anxiety of the mechanism and how people are going to die. And I think it's down to an individual who's assessing the patient as to whether they interpret that as suffering. I certainly do. I think that is suffering. Living with an axe over your head is not fun, and that is a form of psychological torment and suffering. So, and many of my colleagues also hold that same belief. So that is the most common reason that people apply. That is the most common reason that people tick that suffering box. You do have other cases where there is physical suffering, but our experience is that's actually in the minority, and palliative care do a fantastic job of controlling those sorts of symptoms. And just as I brought it up, in terms of working palliative care and voluntary assisted dying, people often set us in opposition, and that's not what we're there for. In much of my voluntary assisted dying work, I've been able to link in people with palliative care who didn't know about the services that they could offer, and help the end of life care experience. And that's all that I'm interested in. And voluntary assisted dying is a component of end of life care. It's not the only thing that we offer, and palliative care is a central part of all of that as well. So it's not either or, it's often both.
Yeah. And so what effect has it had on your patients and also their families? You know, what difference do you see in a patient once they will ask you, you know, to start the process, or if once they're accepted, what effect does that have?
It's just profoundly relieving. It's taking the weight of the world off their shoulders in many, many cases. And because people aren't afraid of death at this stage, they've been dealing with a terminal illness for often many months or years prior to the time they meet me to discuss these issues. They know the reality of what they're facing, and they're okay with that. Often we're not. We haven't come to terms, but often the patients actually know more about where they're up to than we do. And what they are worried about is what form that's going to take. Is it going to be wasting away and lying in a bed and having someone to toilet you and you know and is that acceptable to individuals? And personally, it's not acceptable to me. I would not accept that. Many other people would, and that's perfectly fine. That's why there's individualization in healthcare, because we're all different. But, you know, when they're worried about that and then they suddenly get offered and found eligible for and provided a backup plan, a insurance plan, a contingency plan to make sure that no matter what happens, their worst fears are not going to materialize, that has a profound effect on their anxiety and their concern about how things are going to go from then on. So often they don't worry about things anymore and they just get on with enjoying whatever they can. It's been really remarkable, the change in quality of life that we've seen anecdotally. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've got a question. I mean, I've got another question, but we may as well see there's one that's come into the chat. Keith and Catherine have asked, what is the reasoning behind not allowing people who later develop dementia to not allow such a choice, like in an advanced care directive?
That's a good question. Look, I think it's delving quite deep into ethics there, and I can see that you don't want to make a decision for something you don't have the insight into beforehand. But I'm with you, Keith and Kevin. I think it should, I think it could be a consideration to have that available to people who, never wanted to end up like that. But, the reality of trying to get this legislation through members of parliament, politicians, is that there are certain things that they're comfortable with and certain things that they're not. And they want to enact change most of the time. They do want to help and represent their constituents, but they don't want to be seen as being extremists or going too far. So they need to make sure that there's a safe way of doing things. And so that's why often there are put in all these safeguards. And I guess that's one safeguard that hopefully will be addressed in future revisions of legislation or proposed legislations in the future. But I think that's difficult. Yeah.
Sure. So I asked you before about the effect on your patients, but how's it being involved in the assisted dying scheme affected you as a doctor?
I think it's given me a fascinating insight into what truly our patients go through. To use an anecdote of a young girl, I did provide a practitioner administration, that's intravenous administration, to her a couple of weeks ago. One of the times that I saw her is the second time, and she when I first met her, she was telling me she wasn't sleeping very well. So one of the first things I said when I saw her the second time is, how have you been sleeping? And she said, I slept well last night because I was able to prop the doona off of my body so it didn't feel like it was crushing me all night. And that was just the epitome of the fact that we had, I had no concept that a doona could provide a sensation of being crushed to a 30-year-old girl. I don't think I knew about what suffering was out there. I think I do have a better insight into it now. In terms, it's given me that perspective. And you know, I do home visits for many of these patients, and for an oncologist to step out of their ivory tower and do a home visit is a bit unusual. But I think that's given me a big insight into how patients are at home and what their home setups are like. I think it's made me a better doctor. I think the low uptake of this by medical professionals in Victoria has been a real strain on people who have taken it up. So I haven't, you know, I've been involved in over 100 cases, but that's not because I stand on the corner with a sign begging people to apply. It's because people are needing this, and there are not many of us who are providing it. So, and the nature of the suffering and the urgency of these applications, you know, does require a level of emotional investment. This isn't 9 to 5 work. This is home visits after hours. This is, you know, this is tough, and it's been tough on me, and it's been tough on my family. But you know, behind every reasonable man, there's a better woman. So my wife's been incredibly supportive through all of this. So.
Well, I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of everyone here and probably all of Victoria. We're very grateful that you've taken on all that work, and hopefully as the laws pass in other states and it becomes more normal, the workload will spread and you can get back to your family and a more sort of normal life.
I think the other thing that I'd mention is that it does feel, it has been a real, I guess, anticlimax in terms of the concerns about being involved in this kind of work, you know, whether, you know, your referrals were going to drop off, or your other doctors would look down on you or think you weren't, you know, doing, you're a traitor to your cause, or any of those problems. That's really not happened from that standpoint. It's really, I was talking to someone the other day, and they said it sounds very much like what gay marriage introduction was like. It just kind of came and went, and the day, you know, the sun rose and the days continued, and it really kind of has been from that point of view. There hasn't been a lot of backlash from doing it.
Well, that's great. Well, look, we might move on now, just keeping a bit of an eye on the clock. As I mentioned, New South Wales, well, there's things happening every state except New South Wales, but advocates like Janet and I are really not willing to wait until the next term of Parliament, because that's what has been mentioned. The next election is 2023, and that's just too far away. So maybe at this point, it's a good time to hand over to Janet. And Janet, could you tell us, you know, what does it mean? What would it mean if we had an assisted dying law here in New South Wales?
Thank you, Shayne. Yeah, happily. Look, first of all, it'd mean that campaigners like yourself could take a well-earned break. Shayne's been on this case for over 7 years, and many others have been similarly, you know, hammering on politicians' doors for many, many years. So it's high time that this legislation was introduced. What it would mean for me in a political sense is that the people of New South Wales' voices would finally be heard, and that our democracy was actually showing some signs of health. It would totally renew my faith in New South Wales politicians, who currently seem to be more concerned with about party politics, quite frankly, rather than the wishes of the majority of the people that actually voted them in. So they really need to hear from us, from their constituents, that we really want this to change. But what it would mean to me personally is that, look, I'm currently very well and I'm enjoying life right now, and I certainly don't spend every waking moment thinking about my eventual demise. But I really, in reality, I just don't know what the future holds for me. And as Cam was saying, particularly how those final months of a degenerative, you know, terminal illness are going to play out. I've got no idea. So having voluntary assisted dying legislation in New South Wales would mean, as he said, so rightly said, would mean that I could just relax and not have to think about, okay, do I go to Tasmania when the bill's introduced there? Should I be thinking about moving to Victoria right now? It would just be such a relief. And to say that it would ease my mind is a total understatement.
Mm. So Cam was right in saying that it leaves. I mean, you've obviously made plans to go to Switzerland, and COVID and the travel restrictions has obviously changed that a bit. But fortunately, you're well at the moment. But has getting the green light from Dignitas, or not Dignitas, actually, you're with Life Circle.
That's right.
Did that alleviate, you know, your anxiety looking to the future?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, I like to plan. I like to have a contingency plan. And I think most people do. We plan for all sorts of things in our lives. But when it comes to death, for some reason, maybe we leave things to chance. We don't have an option to do that, to plan effectively in New South Wales at the moment. So, yes, I did join. I joined Dignitas initially, and then saw Dr. Erica Pricey in a documentary, and joined Life Circle organisation in 2016. There are currently 3 Swiss organisations that accept applications from foreigners for an assisted death. That's Dignitas, Life Circle, and another newer one, I think it's called Pegasus. I've got a couple of new challenges now. One of them is to outlive COVID if this legislation isn't passed in New South Wales. And yeah, but it has to. We're hoping, you know, next year that the parliamentarians will get together, and it would be fantastic to have a cross-parliamentary, cross-party working group, bring a bill and finally have this thing debated. Just a word about suffering. I mean, some opponents say that suffering is ennobling, but if you have a terminal illness, you already know about suffering 101. You've been there, done that, as Cam was saying, and more of the same in the last months of your life is simply unnecessary and, quite frankly, barbaric. I certainly want to leave behind a peaceful, dignified memory of someone who ended their life at the time and manner of their choosing, and I don't want my friends and family to have a legacy of indelible memories of pain and suffering. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yes, I know you definitely did. And you've obviously, you know, chosen to use some of the precious time that you have left. And when you started to advocate for dying with dignity, your prognosis was probably not as good as it is now. So what made you do that? I mean, as you mentioned, I've been on this campaign for 8 years now. So my mum died 8 years ago of an aggressive brain cancer. And in that time, I've got to know many, many people who, similar to you, have faced a terminal illness, but they've stepped up and you know, done things. So what made you do that, and what sort of things have you done over the last?
Well, Shayne, it was really a natural progression from my working life of 30 years. I've always worked in the community sector in various ways, and I've always been really interested in helping community voices to be heard on no matter what issue. So it was quite a natural thing for me to think, oh, okay, I can actually use my story to add to those stories of others to finally get this change across the line. So it was really consistent with my values, and it's also, I've met some really amazing people through the work that I've been doing, the volunteer work, and it's just, they've inspired me and they've reaffirmed my values and my belief that this is the right way to go and that this should be available to all people in Australia. So yeah, that's really why. And just like every day matters to someone with a terminal illness, every story matters as well. And particularly to people who have a terminal illness, I think being involved with this campaign has given me a new sense of purpose, perhaps a new sense of hope, and great to meet like-minded people.
Great. That's fantastic. Well, I just want to remind everyone that you can ask questions. So someone already has asked one to Cam. So please, if you've got a question for either Cam or Janet, type it into the chat and we'll get to it. But if it's okay, I'll move on and start talking a little bit about the campaign here in New South Wales, because I assume that most people here, and it's not a question, maybe we should ask for a show of hands, how many of you are actually in New South Wales? I can't see page 2, but there's a lot on page 1. So obviously you're all interested in the thing that I'm most interested in, and that's when is New South Wales going to catch up? As I said, the politicians, the current New South Wales Parliament, we know that there are supportive MPs in the Parliament. The bill in 2017 failed in the upper house by just 1 vote. And to be honest, I burst into tears. I was in the Parliament because we had those votes. We had 2 extra ones. And on in the last day, they changed their vote. So that was heartbreaking. But we know that there are people, because we've been lobbying, as Janet explained, you know, visits to MPs, we knew that the numbers were growing in the lower house as well. So it was really, you know, when that failed, we knew there would not be another attempt till after the 2019 election. Straight after the election, Penny Hackett, the president of Dying with Dignity, and I went back to Parliament, met a lot of the new members, particularly the upper house members. We got very good responses. So we were expecting a bill to be introduced in 2019. But unfortunately, a few of the MPs made the decision to move on the Abortion Law Reform Act Law Reform Bill first. And the rest is history. I don't know how many of you followed that. And that was a very important bill. I'm certainly not taking away from that. But unfortunately, what it did, it nearly destroyed the Liberal government. There were right-wing religious members of the Liberal Party who threatened to leave the party. Gladys would have lost her majority. It was really a very grueling debate. And also the Labor Party, a lot of the Labor Party members who represent seats in Western Sydney, where there's a high migrant population, were getting calls from all sorts of people, you know, really abusive calls about the abortion debate. So they really don't want to face a similar thing again. But as we've said, every day that we don't have a bill, someone else is going to die badly, even with palliative care. But in saying that, I want to be clear, as Cam pointed out, this is not a choice between, you know, palliative care or assisted dying. Assisted dying is like just the last tool in the toolkit. So, you know, we have one of the best palliative care systems in the world. And my mum obviously knew from her diagnosis that there was nothing that doctors could do. She was given less than 12 months to live. She actually only lived for 7.5 months and her condition deteriorated. But my mum loved life. She had 5 beautiful grandchildren and she really did want to live for as long as possible. It was only in the last 15 days that she started to ask myself and her partner and my sisters to end her life. And there was nothing we could do because under the current law, you know, it's not legal to help someone. I'm sure if Mum had been physically able to take her own life, she would have considered it. I'm sure she was so desperate. And unfortunately, that's what is also happening. And it's one of the main reasons why the laws have changed in Victoria and WA, is because there's evidence that some very desperate terminally ill people take matters into their own hands and die, you know, through suicide, which is lonely, desperate, and usually violent. Now that traumatizes not just the families left behind, but first responders. The other legal option that people have now, if they're suffering a lot, is to refuse all medical treatment, including food and water, and basically starve and dehydrate to death. And that, again, it's a very long process. It can take days or even weeks. And that's a very cruel thing for the person psychologically and for the family that's at the bedside. And then the third legal option is, if the suffering becomes unbearable and untreatable, is a doctor can make a decision to put the person into what they refer to as terminal sedation. And I'm sure that most people have probably heard of friends or family members who have, again, had that happen. And that is what happened with my mum. However, the amount of medication that my mum was given was not at a level that I expected, that she was still clearly suffering. So, you know, that is why we don't want to wait until the next term of Parliament, because we now know, as I said, from around the world and particularly from Victoria, that there's a better way to die. And there's some really amazing stories. Family members are speaking up and they're describing the deaths as beautiful. And maybe Cam, I think I'm just checking the time. I think we're okay. Is that how you would describe? I mean, or has that been described to you? Do you feel the families, the comparison between what happened to my mum and what's happening in Victoria?
Yeah, by far and away, that's the most common description of voluntary assisted dying deaths is the word beautiful. It's mentioned almost, you know, every time. Or peaceful probably challenges it. So I suppose either of those words are quite good to have associated with your death. So, I mean, in actuality, what really happens is someone takes a drink of 30 mils of liquid, and then 3 to 5 minutes later, they fall asleep. And then a certain time after that, they stop breathing. And you get that, patients and their families get that moment where they know that that's happening. You know, we often have people admitted in hospital for many days, many weeks on drivers, like you said, Shayne, even if that's not just for terminal sedation, but just symptom control. And no one really knows when they're going to die. And families are often in the hospital for days or weeks on end. They rarely shower, they rarely eat, they are exhausted, hungry. And then they finally go and have a shower or go out to get something to eat, and the patient passes away. And that happens quite more than by chance. So that's very common, and it's not, I mean, who would choose that over having a drink of 30 mils of liquid, having a final hug with everyone that you want to be there, present at the time, say everything that needs to be said, and fall asleep.
Well,
it just doesn't compare.
And it's certainly what my mum wanted, and I think that she thought that would happen. I think I remember her asking her neurologist at the first appointment, you know, you'll help me at the end, won't you? And he never answered. I mean, he couldn't answer because, of course, it's not legal, but I think she did sort of trust that, you know, she would be looked after. And I must admit, I think I was the same, very naive. I now know, because of all the stories that I've heard, that it's not possible. Well, it does happen occasionally, but those doctors would be definitely working in a legal grey area and taking huge risks. So we do need to have assisted dying legislation so that everyone is protected and that the patient, you know, is the one who chooses how they die. So we've still got time. I'd like to tell you, I'm not sure how many people who've come tonight are very sort of keen supporters of our issue, but I'll assume that the majority of you are. 85% of Australians, according to polling, do support voluntary assisted dying laws. So we'll just assume that 85% of the people here do as well. So our challenge now, obviously, is to put pressure on the MPs that, as I said, we know they're in there. They were going to vote for the bill in 2017. So Dying with Dignity in October, so 2 months ago, launched a campaign called Everyday Matters. And this time we've decided to build a grassroots campaign. So we had this online launch, and hundreds of people attended that. So pages and pages of faces like you guys. And out of that, we've now got over 250 what we call campaign champions. So they're people who are willing to just, you know, step up and do a little bit more. And it's not that everyone has to do as much as, say, Janet is doing, but just whatever they can, you know, talking to their friends and family, emailing friends and family, sharing social media posts, all those sorts of things. We're about to launch so we're actually trying to form pods, so in regional sort of areas. We need, Dying with Dignity is based in Sydney, and most of the board, well, in fact, all the board members are in Sydney, but we really need to have this campaign spread across the state, and we need, you know, supporters in every electorate to be going into their MP's office, making an appointment or calling, writing letters, because every single one of them needs to hear from the 85%. Otherwise, they'll just keep putting it in the too hard basket. We're about to launch a petition which will call on so members of the Parliament there, because they're going into recess if they haven't already gone into recess over the Christmas period. So we really need to have that community sort of press. So Janet, if as a campaign, Dying with Dignity campaign champion, if there are people here attending that would like to do more, can you sort of maybe tell us, you know, what sort of things they could do?
Oh, look, I think it's we need as many different levels of involvement as possible, and it's really a matter of finding what works for you, given your skills and your current situation. You could sign up as a supporter or a member of Dying with Dignity New South Wales. You could join a local group, which is basically what I did and how I got involved. And I think more importantly, you can really inform yourself about the issue. There's a lot of great information on Dying with Dignity New South Wales website and other websites such as Go Gentle Australia, that's Andrew Denton, the organisation that Andrew Denton started. And talk to people, just talk to your doctor, medical professionals, physiotherapists, anybody in the medical profession you come across, because I think they are really interested and they want to know more. So don't be afraid to raise the subject with all and sundry, including family and friends. It also really helps you become a better advocate if you talk to as many people as possible, get their feedback. It can be something as demanding or challenging as doing a television interview or you know, a radio interview, but it could also be something as simple as just signing the petition and sharing it with family and friends and getting it out there in the community. So I would really encourage anybody that has any interest in seeing this bill get across the line in New South Wales to take some simple action, because no contribution is insignificant. At the moment, we're actually looking for somebody who's a spreadsheet genius to be able to keep a database for us of media contacts across the Mid-North Coast and other places. So if anybody out there knows of anyone who's a, you know, whiz with spreadsheets and technologically conversant, that'd be great. So everything, really, everything and anything.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. Well, look, we're actually, because I wanted to definitely allow a lot of time for questions. We're actually sort of, you know, coming towards the end. So I'd really encourage, if anyone has any questions, to please put them in the chat, because we do have time. Obviously, as far as being a supporter, Janet's outlined a lot of the things that you could do. Dying with Dignity is the peak advocacy group in New South Wales. So you don't have to join as a financial member. That would be lovely, because we depend on donations to run our campaigns and bequests, etc. But we also encourage people to just sign up, and that by signing up, you're basically just giving us your name and email address. That way we can communicate with you. And look, I'm very optimistic. I'm always the most optimistic one on the board. I sort of have to think that this is achievable. Otherwise, I just don't think I could keep going. It's exhausting. So our current campaign, you know, has 4 phases. So the first phase was to have the launch, get our champions to sign up and help us build a better campaign, you know, work more effectively. So we're now in phase 2, which is the lead up to Christmas and the first few months of next year, where, as I said, we're going to be asking people to contact MPs, encourage the ones who do support assisted dying to work together, because, as I said, we're not going to get a government bill here in New South Wales. Like, the Victorian bill was a government bill. The Western Australian bill was a government bill, and the one in Queensland that's coming next year is also a government bill. That's a lot easier to get through because you've got all the resources of the government. You know, they support it. There's Parliamentary Council to help with drafting, etc. But Mike Gaffney in Tasmania is showing that private members' bills can work. Here in New South Wales, the ideal thing for us, realistically, the ideal thing would be to get a number of MPs across the political spectrum to work together and co-sponsor the bill. So that's what they did with, I don't know if you know, but the abortion law reform bill had, I think, 13 co-sponsors. That way it can't be seen as a political thing. Kate Fairman, when my mum died, just a few months later, I knew I wanted to do something, but I just didn't know what. And I heard on ABC radio, I was up on, you know, the Mid-North Coast, and I heard on radio, Kate Fairman, who was a Greens member of the upper house, had introduced a bill, and I thought, this is it. So I rang her office and said, you know, what can I do? And her staffer that I spoke to said, you can tell your story. So I was on ABC, I had to drive down to Sydney, and I was on ABC News on the day that she introduced the bill. But the problem there was that it was a Greens bill, and unfortunately that's the sort of the kiss of death, unfortunately, for any legislation, as you probably know. The Greens have always been supporters of assisted dying. They will always support assisted dying. But this bill needs to have support across Labor, Liberal, and all the other small parties. So I think we do have some questions now. So what is happening in the Mid-North Coast particularly? Well, I don't know whether I should put Paul on the spot. Paul, I can see you're there. Would you mind just saying what's happening on the Mid-North Coast? Obviously, COVID, I'm not sure if Kate can, or where's our tech person, Kia, can maybe unmute. Yeah, I think you've been unmuted, Paul. Do you want to say a few words about the Dying with Dignity group on the Mid-North Coast?
Yes, thanks, Shayne. As you know, we've been going since 2014 and with a lot of members. Unfortunately, in 2020, we did slow down. Elka's watching in, and she's on our team at the moment as well, basically because there was nothing happening in New South Wales. So we put ourselves into what we call idle mode. And basically that's where we've been. And then, of course, COVID hit. So we haven't been able to have any meetings anyway. So I suppose from what you're doing now, we will take that up again, and hopefully a lot of our members will be able to come back. But we ran into the difficulty of guest speakers and trying to have things of interest to get people there, and it's a lot of work, and particularly in Port Macquarie, where a lot of people have to travel great distances, and that became a bit of an issue. But we haven't gone away. And I think, as you said before, we've got quite a few members in our group, and it is a big group, and it's been a very active group over many years. And I think we've raised quite a bit of money for DWD anyway, particularly when we had Andrew Denton here early in the piece. And I think we had something like 500 people at the Glass House that night.
That's right.
So yeah, we're still here, but idling away in the background, keeping our eye on what's happening and ready to jump as soon as we can. So.
Excellent. So Janet also, as I said, signed up as a campaign champion, and she's also sort of committed to being a pod leader. So we're looking at a cluster sort of, definitely around Port Macquarie, where we know there's lots of supporters, but also further north, Coffs Harbour, and there's someone up in Coffs Harbour that's going to help Janet. So if anyone is interested, we'd love you to sign up, and then there would be an email sent around, and we can put you in contact with Janet and the other leaders, and obviously Paul, because, you know, we can still, we've all managed to do the Zoom here tonight. So even if, as I said, I've attended a few of the Dying with Dignity meetings at Port Macquarie, and it's always was a great turnout at the Port Panthers. And is that what it was? Port Macquarie Panthers?
Yeah.
It was great. I loved coming up there, and you know, maybe we can't have those meetings anymore, even though things are improving, but I'm sure that in these pods, we will be able to hold these sorts of Zoom things. And I'm hopeful that there will be a glimmer of hope sometime before Christmas. So we just, have to keep that in mind.
Shayne, can I just say,
Yeah, sure.
sorry.
No.
Right now we're looking for somebody in Oxley, for someone who's got who lives in Oxley and knows the local scene, to be able to join that mid-north coast pod of 5 electorates, which runs from Myall Lakes right through to Coffs Harbour. We've got myself and Paul, obviously, in the DWD group in Port Macquarie. We've got another person in Coffs Harbour, but the ones in between are a little hazy. So if anyone would like to join us, I'd particularly like a co-pod leader. Yeah. It'd be wonderful.
Oh, well, that's where I lived for 15 years, so I should be able to chase up a friend or two to Oxley was my seat. So,
and I think that's always been one of the issues, Shayne. It has been pretty active in Port Macquarie, and I think we won't take all the credit, but I think we've had a fair bit to do with Leslie Williams changing her mind. Whether the change of horse now changes her thinking or not, I don't know, but there's certain, and Oxley is one issue that needs a fair bit of attention, I'd suggest.
Yes.
And probably along with the others. And I mean, we've had people come to our meetings from Coffs and from all those other areas. We just need them to now go and do something with the politicians in that area, and if we can organise that, but not an easy task, or it hasn't been.
No. Well, okay. I just wanted to ask Cam one last question. I think we're getting close to the end. But Cam, obviously Victoria was the first state to manage to get this across the line, and I watched and listened to most of the debate. And I know that those 68 safeguards, the bill was sort of amended. There's a lot of things in the bill that were put in as safeguards but may be seen as hurdles. Are there things, do you think that bills, like the Western Australian bill, and as each bill gets done, that, you know, what are the things that, are there problems? I mean, I don't want you to be obviously too critical of the scheme, because obviously it's fantastic, it was the first, but do you think there's room for improvement?
Absolutely. You know, I think it's unfair to expect them to have got it right. So there's certain things about residency that we would like changed. So at the moment, the interpretation of Australian citizen or resident, it really means that it's citizenship or permanent residency status on a visa. So I have a patient at the moment who's lived who's not left the country in 10 years, not left the state in 5 years, who owns property and has worked in industry in Victoria, and he's not eligible. He can access every other medical service within the state and within the country, but he can't access this. That's wrong, and that needs to be addressed. So that's one of the big things that we want to introduce. I don't think that a specialist really needs to be involved in the assessment process, and I think that, you know, when you look at the number of GPs versus the number of medical oncologists in any given state, they just pale in comparison. And so having one of the two assessments done by a medical oncologist is really not very is not optimizing the workforce that's there. The benefit that we provide is the prognosis, and that can be done as a consult to that they then use. There's certainly other things. I mean, people might think that are slippery slope and changing stuff and all the rest of the things that you've mentioned, Trevor. There's also actually things that I would like to tighten as well. The current situation in Victoria is that, say, one of my patients applies I assess them as eligible and I refer them directly to a second doctor for their assessment. So I choose that assessment. That makes it not totally independent and impartial. I think that process needs to be centralized and randomized and blinded so that these doctors don't know, the doctors who are referring to them, because there's always going to be pressure. Say that person is, my number one referrer just referred me a patient and they've already said they're eligible and I don't think they're eligible. There's pressure there to make a decision. So I think there's certainly things that can change in both directions. And it is absolutely unfair. The other thing, the young girl that I mentioned before, the reason I was seeing her, she was found eligible prior to me seeing her. She'd been assessed by 2 independent doctors, neither of which were me. She had been found eligible. She had received a permit. She had received her medication, and she was ready to go. She lost the ability to swallow. So she then needed intravenous administration, and neither of her doctors who were involved were willing to provide that. And that's not, they're perfectly within their rights and they should be protected in terms of making that decision about what they will or won't be involved in. They shouldn't be forced to be. But the current legislation meant that we actually had to throw her case in the bin and start again. So there are definitely cases that highlight things that need to change. And I think that my feedback to the board is that they need to start generating this talk of change, because if we suddenly say at the 5-year review mark that, there's these things that have been proposed all of a sudden, and people are going to not want to let them through. But I think the expectation should be that things need to change. I also think that the legislation introduced into other jurisdictions need to learn from this. So I've been talking to Mike Gaffney. I've been trying to contact Cohen in South Australia. I've certainly provided feedback to the Queensland draft bill. So I think we need to learn from the experiences and realise that we didn't get it right, and there are things that can be done better.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that hopefully all of that conversation will continue, and obviously continue around all the states. It's just going to be flat out in 2021. So I think advocates like me will just have to try and take a little bit of a break over Christmas, because we do all work together, and it's going to be a big year for assisted dying around in Australia. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kate and Kia, for your time tonight and for hosting this event. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you in particular, obviously, Janet Cohen and Dr. Cam McLaren. So we'll call it a night, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for dialing in and the invitation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.